Jason Rovito is the proprietor of, wait for it, Jason Rovito Bookseller, located in Toronto. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Now, you personally are physically located in Toronto, but do you have a by appointment shop or what do we got right now?
No, not so much. I used to have a shop in the city, and then moved to a different model where I was pretty much splitting my time, half time in Europe and half time in Toronto, which has obviously changed with the pandemic. So I guess I have what the Italians would call a sort of studio model. Bibliographical studios, how they seem to refer to it as. I'm always happy to receive guests, but I work out of my apartment. I have a home office, and that's where I do my cataloging and photography and whatnot. And then, exhibiting. My main public front-facing sort of persona is either through book fairs, which are not happening physically right now, or through lists that I put out to my mailing list.
Okay, because I was in Toronto, and I'm trying to remember when it was. It was probably 8 or 9 or even 10 years ago, and I was walking along. It might have been Queen Street, and I saw this sign for your bookstore. So I went up the stairs and we met.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I was on College. I had 2 shops on College, which in a 3-year period, that's probably a bad sign. One was on the 2nd and 3rd floor, College and Spadina. And then we moved, quote unquote, out of there to a place that was actually below ground, College in Dovercourt. But yeah, the first spot was kind of, I think, in total, I was there for about 2 years.
And yeah, I can't walk past a sign that says bookstore without checking it out. So, but you say that this wasn't sustainable. So why wasn't it?
It's interesting that you said that you can't pass up the opportunity, even if it's on a 2nd floor. But for the vast majority of people, I discovered that you need a street front presence just to get people walking through. So the part of the problem was location, being either upstairs or downstairs. So the commercial rents in Toronto were just absurdly priced, and still are, if you're going to be selling books, which seem to have a bit of an inelastic price set to them. So the types of books I was selling there were more academic, but trade books, not necessarily rare books. And you'd end up getting a Giorgio Agamben, which is very popular. You buy it for $3 or $5 off somebody, and then you put it out for $12 or $15, and it flies right off the shelf. And then you have the problem of trying to find another Giorgio Agamben. So it was a tricky balancing act, but I came to it as an academic, as more of I was doing graduate research on curiosity at the time. And so I kind of opened the shop under that horizon, and not exactly as someone that knew what cash flow meant or had any sense of how you build a business plan. So had I been a bit more business minded, it may have been sustainable, but as it was, trying to make the rent selling $20 books was just a bit of a fool's game for this fool anyway. So
now I'm working off the Fine Books and Collections profile that you sent me that was conducted back in 2013. And in that you talk about cabs. Can you tell me about that experience?
Yeah, definitely. It was kind of integral to that transitioning away from that bookshop model.
And what is cabs? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know how we're supposed to talk about it anymore, because so the acronym stands for the Colorado Antiquarian Book Seminar, which I'm going to get the specifics wrong, but it's been in operation for about 30 years or so. In the year of the pandemic, they had moved to Minnesota.
Is that because Roland Miller's there, or?
Yeah, so Rob's been one of the longstanding faculty members there. I don't understand what the impetus was to leave Colorado State, but I think the fact that Rob is in Minnesota, or is in Minneapolis, or is it St. Paul? I can never remember.
Yeah.
I think that definitely helped. But of course, they had to cancel their inaugural session. So they're going to plan to do, at the very least, something virtual in the coming year. But so I don't know if we still refer to it as cabs, or if it's MABS now, I'm not sure. But the idea behind it being that, again, it's been for a number of decades now, and there's an interesting group of American antiquarian booksellers and also some international that lead up a faculty, and it's a week-long intensive course.
Can anyone attend?
Yeah, the demographics tend to be a pretty even, well, no. The main type of person that attends is a bookseller. It may be a bookseller that wants to know how to sell more efficiently on Amazon, or it may be someone that's interested in sort of this sort of new tradition of antiquarian bookselling, which kind of the faculty members all are part of that kind of movement. And then and some of the people on the faculty are also librarians. Some of the people in attendance are librarians, and then collectors also make up, I'd say, maybe about 10 to 15% of the students. And so you have intensive classes for the week, and then especially if it's a good cohort of students, there's a lot of learning that happens late at night over a few bottles. What did I learn?
Yep.
How much I could drink. That was an interesting. I mean, on one hand, I'd been an academic, although I'd never really leveraged special collections with my particular research, but I was aware of rare book libraries tied to sort of academic graduate programs.
So you got a PhD?
I get the letters ABD, which all but dissertation. I was writing the dissertation and then opened the bookshop. So yeah, what I'd never thought of at the time, well, I was a grad student, is where the materials come from that graduate students and faculty members work on at the special collections libraries. So that was probably the one takeaway from CABS that I really walked away with, is one of the strategies or practices that they advocate is a close working relationship between librarians and booksellers. And so it dawned on me that, oh, right, there's a sort of type of rogue academic that ends up in the book trade and still pursues sort of scholarly endeavors rather than getting paid by one university, they sort of go around hunting for things, selling them to librarians, and so it's still a form of scholarship. So that was really eye-opening. And again, just eye-opening to see the manner in which relationships were really key. So while having a shop, it was all about finding books as, I don't want to say commodities, but as inventory to flip, and then you sold it and you needed another one. And whereas on this side of the trade, it's much more about developing relationships, getting to know what people are interested in, what they need, getting to know who has things that you can source, etc. So it's still obviously about the actual item in the end, but the item becomes a part of a larger network. And then on top of that, the year I was there in particular, one of the themes that kept popping up was about sort of the storytelling sort of approach to bookselling, and the danger that I had fallen into for a little while was trying to tell far too long of a story about a $30 item. So trying to find the balance where there's a summary on the back of the book for a reason, I guess. Yeah. When you have those opportunities, don't recreate the wheel.
So you mentioned too that about drinking, that you also made some important connections, built some relationships there. Who did you meet there?
Yeah, I mean, I should say that that's probably the most important part of CABS was, and it's funny because you would think, okay, like I was there 2012 and it was a fairly exceptional group of people.
That's because you were there, right?
Obviously, yes. You hear that over and over again. So there seems to be something in the water there. But yeah, our year seemed to be really significant. So, I mean, I probably will forget somebody I probably shouldn't, but Philip Penka was there, he's now with Penka Burnett, or Burnett Penka, I guess. Heather O'Donnell was there of Honey and Wax. Seth Glick was there. David Anthem was there. Who else were some of the students? Travis Lowe, who was with Ken Sanders at the time.
And you guys were all fairly young and just looking to learn, obviously.
Young, and yet we all kind of had our own experiences and our own approaches. None of us were fully formed by any sense, but we kind of had our inclinations or qualities. So it just made for a really interesting group. And then Adam Davis from Division Leap was the guest speaker. So every year they have a guest speaker, and he gave a really interesting talk on enthusiasm, on how that was the real object that we are trading in is enthusiasm for material, and trying to package that and help the collector share in that enthusiasm. That's really the telos of the trade.
What I want to call, I should have said at the beginning, what I want to call our episode here is hunting for value within this strangeness.
Yeah, this strangeness could refer to a heck of a lot in the 21st century, but yeah, I think that's a good title. And there is something about the hunting for value phrase that I think it explains a lot of what the dealers that I consider colleagues, that they're all sort of engaged in that, and they all have their own means of doing so, which also makes sense.
Okay, so you talked about a new tradition. What's that new tradition then?
Yeah, the ABAA has the name of the blog on their website, I believe, I should double check this, but it's called like the New Antiquarians. Because as soon as you hear the word antiquarian, it sort of has these connotations, especially for people under the age of 40 or whatnot. So I thought that was a pretty decent label, kind of a new antiquarianism. I think, as we've sort of briefly discussed previously, it's very much tied to, I don't know if it's a second generation, but the second wave of internet book selling, whereas the first wave of internet book selling, when it popped up, was pretty much about dealers being able to upload their inventory files and make them public and searchable across the world. And so that first wave really represented a reorientation of the concept of scarcity, where a dealer who lived in the Midwest may have only seen one copy of a book their entire career, and then and so they rightfully so educated their customers to think that this was a scarce book. And then overnight, with all these inventory files being uploaded, it was obvious there were 1,000 copies of these around the world. So there was this sort of migration of books that took place, of books in Europe coming to the United States, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that took a little while to settle, and there were big implications in terms of pricing, et cetera, and models of doing business. There was the sort of drop shipping or book jacking, it's called different things, but that practice developed.
What does that mean?
Well, it's actually how Amazon got started. When Amazon first opened, because Bezos decided he was going to use books as a sort of Trojan horse to get to what he called the everything store, they opened up a bookshop in 93 or 95. And the first day they were open, they didn't have a single book on their shelves. So they exploited I say that more in a morally neutral sense, exploited, but they leveraged a service called Interlock, which was one of these early matching systems where dealers would upload their inventory, and you could upload things your wants, the things you were looking for to search. So what Amazon was at the beginning is you would log in, they would have a huge catalog of books, but they didn't own them. These were books that were available to them through this other service. So you would say, yes, I want to buy book X. They would find that book with another dealer through Interlock, increase the price by 10% or whatever. The drop shipping term comes from the fact that when this intermediary bookseller makes the purchase on behalf of the customer, he or she asks the dealer who actually has the book to ship directly to the customer.
They do nothing other than put the book together with a buyer and get a percentage.
Exactly. They were making the match. I mean, there was overhead in terms of developing a web interface that was searchable and pleasing for the customer to use. So there was like a UI investment that was put into it. Yeah, which is all to say, those were the sort of developments that came out of that sort of first generation.
Sure.
And now this second generation seems to be, finding its own niche. And I think a lot of it has to do with, well, one of the gripes about internet book selling is like, oh, now I have to compete with somebody that doesn't pay high overhead, and they're just selling books out of a barn. And so this book I used to be able to sell for $30 now is only worth $5. So I think the affordances of the internet have become more apparent. So whereas now, if you find a piece of ephemera that otherwise may have just had aesthetic value to it, it just may have been compelling for one reason or another, but when you were holding it, now it just becomes that much easier to do research. I mean, you just make a few passes through a Google search to see if you can start connecting it to a larger context, to different stories. And so in that sense, the way that the internet functions on a research perspective is that it devalues certain things that were produced or mass produced, but it actually helps add value to things that are more unique or more ephemeral.
So basically, technology, the internet, has enabled you to find out relatively easily way more about artifacts, books, ephemera, whatever, and build your story. Is that it? And then find other stuff that would enrich in that story, other material that you could then present to a buyer. Is that it?
Yeah, that's an important dimension of it too, is that once you have your hooks into something and you feel, okay, maybe I have an angle on this story that hasn't been worked before, you can then also use the internet from a scouting perspective to really drill down, or even cast your net very wide, but to start searching with that particular story in mind. So yeah, it helps you start assembling kind of groups of materials, kind of like a magnet in a way. You start with just the raw material, you try to magnetize it, which may be sufficient in and of itself, or sometimes it suggests that, well, in order to bulk this up a bit, you kind of need to bring together other supporting materials or other similar materials. So you might start with one little ephemeral item, and that might become a group, or it may become a list that's sort of a longer form that includes a number of different items in it. I learned something really important from I worked at McGill Library for a few years in Montreal. I was working on this one acquisition, a fairly large private library that had been collected by a collector named Charles Seabright, and mainly kind of early printing, some incunabula. At the beginning of it, just doing a simple Google search, nothing was coming up on the guy. There's about 600 items in the collection, and I was using that computer to do the cataloging. That involved a lot of sort of using Google for, I hate to use a proprietary, to use the name, but nonetheless.
Yeah.
And what I found, so basically I was inputting this guy's library, his collection, into my computer. And the key thing is I never emptied the cache of the browser. And all of a sudden, I would find that the search results would become more and more relevant, and it started leading me into these interesting sort of little wormholes. And every week I would start typing in Charles Seabright just in the Google search to see what would pop up. And all of a sudden he started appearing where he didn't in the first place. So there was something magnetic that had happened to my browser insofar as I had inputted all of these things that he had once touched or owned or acquired. And the search results started becoming more and more relevant. So I think there are even these little weird things, if you want to call that weird, but that like not refreshing your cache in your browser is a really important thing, because it personalizes your experience of what the internet is. So
that's interesting. Okay, so you mentioned that you were interested in the 19th century, but that things on the periphery kept coming up. And this is again from that Fine Books and Collections piece. You used keywords like commercials, hygiene, weekends, white collar, and wireless. So just tell me about what that's all about.
I don't necessarily know what was in my mind when I said that at the time, but as you can tell, I talk a lot of nonsense. But yeah, I think the past few years, I mean, if we are going to refer to this as this kind of new antiquarian thing, one of the key tensions that was discussed a lot at CABS and since then just with colleagues is being a specialist versus being a generalist, and that kind of tension that exists. And again, it seems like some dealers have found a balancing act there. So at the time, that was my way of suggesting that, you know, I did have a certain type of specialism, which I thought would correspond to the 19th century. And those keywords were means of being kind of like a quasi-specialist, being a temporary specialist in hygiene, for instance. But I think the past few years, I've found some success in setting up parameters that are, what are my parameters? It's the avant-garde, design history, and the human sciences. So I try to look at those as three different modalities, I guess. So when I have my avant-garde cap on, those are the types of materials I'm looking for. I've been doing that quite a lot recently. And I sort of have an awareness that I should probably switch caps and move back to the human sciences for a list or two moving forward. Those types of horizons, I think, are important to just train your eye as to like, what am I looking for right now? I mean, it has a very pragmatic function when especially when you're physically scouting and you're in a new city and you visit with a new dealer or you're at a book fair. They always want to know, what are you looking for? And the stock response can often be, oh, well, I'll know it when I see it, but that's not really super productive, because you want to give
you, right? They can't help
right.
you.
Yeah, Doug Stewart, who's a fantastic bookseller from Australia, we've had a few conversations that he helped me understand the importance of that. The importance of helping the other bookseller help you, is important. Yeah.
Well, okay. I mean, the reason that we're talking right now is that I was on your email list, and I find some of your lists, if that's what you want to call them, or sort of electronic catalogs, or they're kind of mind-bogglingly fascinating. Like, how do you make money off these lists? How do you interest people in buying the types of things that you sell? For example, and maybe you could just tell me the process. The one on prisons, that was fascinating. So did you just say, okay, one day you said, okay, I'm interested in prisons? Or did you find something that was about prisons and you said, okay, let's build this?
That one was an interesting process. In undergraduate, I studied, my minor was in criminology, so I had always had a fascination with that. So primarily my clients tend to be academic librarians and curators. And I think at a certain point, it dawned on me, it was like, there aren't really that many interesting criminology collections. And so I knew I'd always wanted to work with that. So
lots of criminology courses too, aren't there, out there?
Yeah, that's what's amazing. Is I find the same with dentistry. That's a current one that I'm frustrated with. I'm like, how is there not a great historical dentistry collection? I had a professor who taught at Ryerson, this is way before I was a dealer. He showed me his personal library, which had a bunch of Lombrosos in it, and was fascinating. I'm like, oh wow, you can collect this stuff.
Lombrosos? What's that?
Cesare Lombroso was an Italian criminologist, and criminology didn't necessarily exist at that time, so I guess he would have referred to himself as an anthropologist. It was an offshoot of physiognomy and phrenology, like how you could tell if somebody was going to be a criminal based on their bone structure, their handwriting, etc. So it's a particular stage in sort of positivist criminology in terms of like how you can start developing a science.
It looks like a criminal because his forehead's jutting out.
Now, the funny thing with Lombroso is part of it was also like graphology. So you can tell whether somebody will commit crimes based on an analysis of their handwriting. So towards the end of his life, he developed, I think it's pronounced arteriosclerosis, and he couldn't write. So his secretary would write out his letters, but he would sign his name. And it was complete chicken scratch, which, I mean, to be sympathetic to the guy, I feel bad that he developed this condition, but he was like the prime candidate to be determined to be a criminal via his own system. So
right.
Yeah, so so I knew I wanted to do something with criminology, and part of the lists is like catering or communicating with collectors I already have or that I know would be interested in this kind of stuff. Part of it too is like trying to find new collectors to work with. And so the prisons one was partially that. I had handled, sort of coincidentally, a great prison atlas by Ramon de la Sagra, I think, the Spanish anarchist who was nonetheless in the legislature at the time, I think 1830s, 1840s. And he traveled through Western Europe and North America conducting a survey of the prisons. And so there was a text component, just an octavo, and then there was an atlas in which the schematics of the prisons were illustrated. It was just a stunning visual document.
So it was a book, was it?
Yeah. With a lot, like an atlas in the sense of like an elephant folio with plates. Yeah, wow. to refer to. So that had already sold, but it got me thinking about prisons. And then it was around the time that I really first started scouting Europe actively. And it was just one of the prompts that I used whenever I met somebody and they're like, oh, what are you looking for? I would say prisons. And they would show me things. Some things wouldn't be interesting, some things would. And eventually I kind of had enough of a bulk of material to start working with.
What made something interesting and what made something not interesting?
That is a good question. I don't want to be precious about it because I can't stand when my colleagues are super precious. Right. There is a qualitative component. Sometimes you're just drawn to something for whatever reason. I think from a cynical, but not necessarily cynical, but from a simple pragmatic perspective, if something is visual, it definitely helps represent it through these sort of electronic lists or catalogs. So for me, the way I do my catalogs, they tend to be these one-pager, like these long vertical scrolls. Yes. If I'm getting something that has some substance to it, and I feel like the story might be like a 3-paragraph story, I know I need like 3 images to pace that story out. If it's an item that has visual qualities to it, I know I can kind of get different angles of it to produce images out of. So there's that kind of, I guess it all comes down to sort of derivative value. Like you want to be able to derive, like the object itself has value in and of itself, but in order to convince somebody to purchase it, you need to derive information, stories, visuals from it to be able to produce the thing that the person sees and first engages with.
What about if that item, which is interesting to you, what happens if there's a bunch of them on the internet for $50 or $15?
So the really banal, or not banal, what's the word I'm looking for? The crass version of that is if you go to these library book sales and you see the if you want to call them scouts, the buyers who are out there with the ISBN scanner.
They're not scouts, they're assholes.
They are robots, yeah. But I mean, to be fair, they're making a living, and
yes, you know, I shouldn't be so harsh. But so they don't really give a shit about the books. Let's put it that way.
Right, they're trying to make sales and trying to make profits. So there's that on the spectrum. There's that in terms of somebody that's so obsessed with, can I have the cheapest copy available? So if they scan the barcode and they see there are 20 copies available for $10, they won't purchase the book. So obviously we don't do that. If I'm visiting with a colleague and I'm unfamiliar with something, I might ask if it's okay to, Lauren Bear is actually really good about this. He'd suggested that whenever somebody comes to visit him at the shop, he makes available a computer and says, like, if you need to do any research, please go ahead. It's not in my interest for you to buy something you can't sell. Like it's a collaborative effort. So, but you also kind of just get good at, once you've done that a number of times, looked something up and either on the spot before buying it or after you've gotten home thinking you found something great and you realize, man, there are 10 copies available, I'm not gonna be able to sell this. Going through that process, you learn what kind of cues to look for in terms of not even needing to go online. You kind of instinctively know. So
what are those cues?
Well, without giving away too many trades, I mean, the imprint is key. You know that every country has, depending on the century, but in every century or half century, each country has a certain few publishers that they just publish widely. You know that each copy would have been printed in a run of 1,000 copies or whatnot, which doesn't mean you dismiss the book altogether, but your spidey sense gets triggered a little bit in terms of like, well, how many other copies are there actually available for this book? And it also depends on what your goal is in terms of turnover, whether you're comfortable just having a large stock of material that sits there. And then I think what a lot of us are looking for these days are, things that are quote unquote unique. So if you can make an obvious association value that this book X was gifted from the author to another person of some significance, then that's obviously unique. If something has some original photographs in it, etc., obviously manuscripts fall into that category. So you train your eye so that you don't have to be constantly going online to see like, oh, well, is this really rare?
Yeah.
Although, sometimes, so I don't sell a lot of editions, except to libraries where they have obvious holes that need filling in specific collections. But, sometimes they're just really interesting. But yeah, from that prisons list, I think the only items that remain unsold were books that were printed in editions that I found interesting, but that aren't necessarily as compelling to purchase on the spot as something that is, of the unique category.
So tell me about going to Europe. You'd go over to Europe, not now, but when it's normal, and you actually just go scout bookstores. You're able to get interesting stuff from them.
Yeah, actually going back to cabs again, Dan DeSimone was on the faculty that he was the librarian at, I think he was still at Library of Congress at that point. And we kind of got along well. And I talked to him sort of at some point during the day and asked for his advice. And he was like, just go to Europe, man. He's like, find $10,000, which to me, I'm like, how the hell am I going to find $10,000? It's like, just find it, go to Europe, buy stuff, come back and sell.
I'm surprised. Don't they know what's going on over there? Like, don't they have the internet over there?
Oh, yeah. They're still on dial-up, or they have Minitel in France still. What's interesting there, and there's a long tradition of this in the trade, like Rosenbach would just go to England, go to the auction houses, find stuff and bring it back to the States. There's always going to be some variance in context once you cross the ocean. So like in Paris, I'm still stunned at some of the stuff that they don't value in the same way we would. Like I found Tristan Zara, like a legal dossier for the book that he never published towards the end of his life. And it was a dossier that included like the contract for the book and then a letter from his lawyer saying time had expired, he wanted everything back, et cetera, et cetera. And the price was incredibly reasonable. I'm just like, wow, they're, Paris, they have too many things by too many Zaras. So you could always find an angle to leverage, I think, is the key when you're not on your own home turf. So I wouldn't say it's untilled. I just think that there's a variance always when you introduce sort of geographical distance. So so Dan had suggested you need just go, you'll make it work. And then about a month before I was scheduled to leave, a bookcase fell on my head, and I suffered like a pretty catastrophic concussion and got wiped out. So almost, what was it, something like 7 years to the day, I did finally go to Europe and follow Dan's advice, albeit 7 years later and a few brain cells fewer. And it worked. I think I was just really lucky. I ended up I timed the trip so that I went for the Milan Fair in January. And I just happened to meet some dealers that I got along with really well. The key difference there is that unlike many colleagues, I do speak Italian. I mean, it's quite rough. So I knew I could leverage that. And the Italian book trade, since that sort of Galileo scandal, had been fairly closed internationally for a variety of reasons.
What's the Galileo scandal again?
I'm going to forget names. There was a quote unquote librarian who was stealing books from a particular library, and then he also forged some. It's a big famous case, and the names are just all escaping me.
When did it take place?
In the mid 2000s. Girolami, but what was the guy's name? The book came out, or a few of them recently, and they're apparently quite fascinating. But things coming out of Italy had a bit of a, unfortunately, for my colleagues over there who suffered as a result of this.
Just like books out of Pittsburgh are a bit of a taint to them now.
Right. So it was, I think the people I met found it interesting that a North American was there scouting, found it interesting that they could communicate with me, however roughly. And yeah, I got invited back to a few people's houses. There were just some gorgeous places where they're like, oh, you just stay with us. We'll cook you fantastic food. We'll go through books and da-da-da. And it was great. And it was a great foundation, because then I had 3 or 4 dealers that I knew I could return to visit. And then with each trip, it was just like, okay, I need to add another 3 or 4 dealers each visit and start developing that kind of a network. And I thought nothing could ever go wrong with this business model. I will keep flying over the Atlantic Ocean forever. And yeah, there seems to have been a bit of a hiccup this year, but.
And one doesn't know how long the hiccup's going to last for either.
I almost went back in September because the Parisians, God bless them, were the only ones in the world that were still having physical book fairs.
Yes, I was there actually in September. I didn't go to the fair, but I was in Paris right before it. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
They did have a physical fair then, right?
Well, there were going to be 3 of them in the course of a month, which is, so I had a plane ticket and I had my accommodations all set up.
Yeah.
2 of them ended up running. The 3rd one was canceled because of the COVID situation at that time. So,
so again, I guess it boils down to you just knowing that you're seeing something really interesting that you can tell a story about that fits in with something you're working on. And you can learn that, but it's a certain risk involved too, I guess, right?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I've bombed it more than once, but I think there are 2 things to that. I think I interviewed Alberto Mangel once when I was doing library school, and I was trying to develop a kind of profile of a book collector, and I'd heard it referred to by a number of dealers, like those interviews that the ABAA has been conducting and archiving with dealers is such an invaluable resource.
They're good. Yeah, they're really good. They're fascinating to watch, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was kind of like a mini university for me, for sure, back when I was stuck in the bookshop. Because everyone, that's the interesting thing about the trade, is nobody does it the same way.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own approach, which makes it such a fascinating subculture. But you do hear commonalities. And one of those was like, it's important to learn from your collectors, and it's a 2-way street. It's not that you're just supplying them with stuff. And so I think when I've gone wrong with my own kind of list making, for lack of a better word, it's because I'm not working with a collector in mind. And so I've tried, first of all, just collecting collectors and knowing what people are collecting and that they're happy to acquire more in that area, but trying to picture what a collector, whether private or institutional, what they would want to be handling and preserving and working with. But the flip side of that is sometimes I take risks. Susan Duff from 10 Editions here, in the last few years of that shop, I got to know Susan a lot better than I had when I had the shop. I wasn't sure how much, when I had my shop, I wasn't sure how much she liked me, because one day I was kind of famous for having like a bunch of Persian rugs because the floor was terrible. There was this auction house where you could get super cheap Persian rugs. And as the business started slowly going, quasi bankrupt, in order to keep myself afloat, I would sell rugs instead. And that was more profitable than selling books. And so Susan at one point was like, you should have just become a rug seller, shouldn't you? But she became a close friend, and she had a real love for ephemera, as did I. So I would acquire these little insurance pamphlets and became fascinated with them as like a form of literature, where the job of the insurance company is to scare you, but they don't want to scare you too much, but they want to scare you just enough so that you're convinced that if you buy their product, that fear will be alleviated. So just from a rhetorical perspective, it's a really interesting tightrope they're walking. So I picked up a bunch of things from her over the years, and then thought, okay, I'm going to do a list on insurance company literature. And I debuted it at the Ephemera Society, and it was like so most of my lists, the only print version of it is I produce a postcard with a visual, super visual recto, and on the back there's a website that takes you to the catalog. Where a bunch of colleagues were like, "This looks great," but they're like, "Who the hell do you think is going to purchase this?" I was like, "You know what? I have no idea." And so that it was a preview day, kind of dealer setup day, and I was at Peter's booth, White Fox, and we were just shooting the breeze, and some guy that I'd never met before, who obviously had a table there, came to Peter and he's like, "Do you have anything on insurance companies?"
No.
And Peter looks at me and we both smile. He's like, "I don't, but you may want to visit this gentleman's booth." And sure enough, he has a client who collects insurance company literature, and he just bought more or less the entire list. So that was an instance where serendipity popped up, and I was very happy it did, because I thought that was going to be a zero sale list.
I imagine you picked his brain too, did you? I mean, if you wanted to stay in that area, it'd be interesting to learn what he was after and why.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was a dealer, but he had a collector that he worked with. Yeah, we've since, especially when I was spending time in London, I would hunt for mostly ephemera, insurance company ephemera, and some fire marks and whatnot. Yeah. But it definitely, that spurred me on to pick up some bibliographies and go through those and try to learn more about the subject area. Yeah.
Bibliography on insurance company ephemera?
Well, yeah, in that case, it's about fire marks. I can't remember the name of it, but there's an interesting history of those little plates that you would put on the front of your building, so that if the firemen showed up, they knew they were supposed to put the fire out, as opposed to like setting a fire and then trying to sell you the insurance.
Okay. Let me just quickly ask you, or go through a little list here. So what did you find for prisons other than the book? What else did you find and put in that list?
Oh, wow. I'm trying to remember. One item was from Paris, from a manuscript dealer who's a friend. It was, of course, I'm going to forget the gentleman's name, but it was a letter written by like 18th century Frenchman who had escaped famously 3 times from various prisons, including the Bastille. It was a letter to the King of Prussia, if my memory is serving me right now, in terms of he's now out of prison, and it explained how he had escaped from prison, how he had like fashioned ink out of his blood and paper out of like bread that he had chewed on, masticated to produce paper. And he was talking about like a military innovation that he'd come up with. So he was looking for work. So that was pretty cool. That was it Littre? Anyway, I should have my computer in front of me. So that was a nice item in there. There was some early, like 18th century ephemera from jailers. No, actually, I think that one was 17th century. From a jailer, it was like an invoice of the various items he had to purchase for the prisoner, so food and rope and whatnot, and he was seeking to get reimbursed. So that kind of helped me narrate that earlier portion of prisons where they weren't state-run, but the jailers sort of had to take personal responsibility. And then similarly, there was like a schedule of tariffs charged by the coachman that would transport prisoners from sort of the jail where they were waiting sentence to the prison where they had to go. So that was some of the ephemeral stuff. And then there was a photo album of like a prison of war camp in World War I.
I don't know what it is about this, but it's really interesting.
Although, yeah, I agree. Although it was funny, it sold well, for whatever that's worth. Oh yeah, one was an architectural diagram for a prison that was going to be built, that had like it was a renovation to a building, a prison, and because they needed to create a separate women's wing, and the women's wing was right next to the laundry, and there were like these interesting things, that elements to this drawing that helped you think about the prison as a form of space. What I was going to say is that I'd envisioned somebody, either an institutional collector or a private collector, picking these things up because they were for a prison collection. But ironically, I didn't find any one collecting prisons per se, but each of them went, so that map of the prison went to a map dealer. The letter from the escapee went to somebody who collects 18th century French material. So it was an interdisciplinary list that I expected to go to people who collected on prisons, but instead each of the items sort of found their way as a sort of tangents in other types of collections. So yeah.
So you cast your net. So how did you get all these things? Was it going to Europe and visiting all these stores, or was it surfing eBay, or what was it?
Yeah, a combination of it all. I mean, that was the first time that I had tried to be somewhat systematic about every time I met a new dealer, just saying, do you have anything on prisons?
Yeah.
And that caused things to surface. And then, once I had a bulk of that, or like a good, starting point, then I would do more targeted online searches and start working with bibliographies or just secondary literature, like scholarly literature on prisons. And my weakness is sometimes it's silly from a commercial perspective, but sometimes I'll be putting things together and I tend to do them chronologically. And so I'll realize that between number 2 and number 4, there's a missing number 3 it'd be really great if this showed like how prison architecture developed. Yeah. But it's a bit of a fool's game, because then I go hunting for something because I feel like it'll fit this narrative. But I mean, that's sort of self-indulgent. But sometimes it works.
It's how your brain's working, isn't it? It wants to organize stuff. I mean, it's curious and it wants to organize stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's value to having, not everyone takes that approach, but having some kind of, even if it's subtle, some overarching narrative to these lists. It gives, even if somebody doesn't buy number 3 there, that may just add more context to number 7 that pushes somebody to realize like, oh, this is actually useful for my collection in this way. So
well, and it's like every collection, isn't it? You really do need to think hard about the parameters of it, the purpose of it, I guess. That's what makes a good collection, is thinking it through really carefully.
Yeah. And it's been great working with collectors and getting to ask them these kinds of questions precisely and getting to see how their minds work. And I think it seems, I don't know how much this is going to become a thing, but I've seen it in a few instances where collectors, I don't want to use the word cash out, but they feel like they've come to an end with the current collection they have, and they'd like to actually start a second collection. And
completely unrelated or related?
No, unrelated. Like, because I would imagine if you were a collector, there would be a moment in time where you have a certain degree of melancholy. You're like, oh, if I could start over again, maybe I would collect this instead.
Yeah.
And so
I have that feeling every 2 or 3 months.
So what's your I wish I had collection?
No, this whole idea of, oh, wouldn't it be fun to start a new collection? I'm thinking about that all the time.
Does it always come back to one thing in particular, or it's different each time?
It's different each time.
That's cool.
But okay, so let's, so you do this in all sorts of different areas, like phrenology was one, office spaces was another, and then Fluxus was, how on earth did you come up with Fluxus? Like you just learned about, maybe you could just talk just a bit about what it is and how you moved ahead with that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
right?
What's that? So the most recent one, yes. Yeah, Fluxus was an art movement, an avant-garde art movement, 20th century, mid 20th century, and it grew out of sort of post-data. So it's almost a cliched collecting area at this point. There was a collecting heyday for it in the late 80s and 90s. And so I'd always kind of shied away from it because it felt a bit cliched. I've sold Fluxus artists before, but I don't know. I think in this case, I just stumbled across a few things that I found interesting and then thought, oh, well, maybe I should actually.
So what were those 2 things or a few things?
What was the sort of the seed for this one? I think there was a dealer in the Netherlands that I was just buying from My memory is a bit, even though this is the most recent one, my memory is for some reason foggy. Just kind of ephemeral material. So this one was composed mostly of ephemera because a lot of Fluxus, the output of the artists who are now considered part of Fluxus, was performative. So I know back when I was in grad school, some colleagues were dealing with, from an art historical perspective, like how do we write an art history of performance art insofar as the performance is live and so I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that's where some of my interest in ephemera came in, was that these are the documents that help you sort of recreate the histories. So
like invitations to the performance?
Yep. So invitations, posters, but what they were known for, so John Cage was a big influence, the experimental composer. And so George Brecht and Dick Higgins and Alan Capro and Al Hansen, they had taken some summer sessions with Cage in 58 and 59, if I'm remembering, and started thinking, but they weren't necessarily musicians, but they were just thinking of composition in a broader sense. And so George Brecht created a form called the event score, where rather than composing a piece of music, it would just be some instructions of how one is to perform in an everyday situation. So one of his most famous ones is just, it's a one-word score, which just says exit. And the performer who is performing that piece decides how to interpret that. So with Fluxus, that you can also collect event scores, which are these sort of algorithmic instructions of how which you can interpret yourself as the performer. So I had a few of those. One of them that I quite like is from Robert Filliou, who's sort of one of the artists I'd been dealing with before this list. He had been looking at what he termed poetical economy as opposed to political economy. And with this piece, it's an invitation, like a leaflet, English on one side, German on the other. And in it, he just explains that you're invited to come down to a gallery in Cologne, where he will shake your hand for the charge of 40 Deutschmarks. And all the money will go to the support of Angela Davis for her defense fund. So on one hand, it's political in that sense, but the real politics of it was that he was exploring, and he writes a small little treatise on this, he was exploring concepts of solidarity value and association value, and there's one other type of value as opposed to like surplus value. And so just the act of shaking hands with someone and being present was enough to produce value. And so, there were different elements like that sort of came together to make that list.
Okay, so we touched on and delved into getting the supply. Now, what about moving that supply to the end buyer? How do you do that?
I beg, please buy this. Well, the main venue, I guess, is I have a mailing list, an email list. So I don't print catalogs. It'd be nice one day too, but I think the economics of it is a bit unsustainable for what I do. So at this point, it's pretty much every 2 months I'll put out one of these sort of thematic lists, and then there are listservs within the sort of rare books community. So there's one called Ex Libris, which so on Tuesdays dealers are allowed, quote unquote allowed.
My inbox gets a good workout on Tuesdays.
Yeah. And it's a long-standing gripe. There's some librarians who really would wish that it didn't exist, but I think it's an important part of collection development. So that I tend to, and these tend to produce parameters or deadlines, I guess, for lack of a better word. Whereas, I mean, that's one of the things that I think a lot of people are missing about physical book fairs is that they just produced a certain amount of structure to the way that your calendar unfolded and helped you have a deadline that you had to work towards and that you had to finish. Because otherwise, you could just continuously work on things. So ex libris, at least, that gives you a hard deadline of a Tuesday. And then quoting individual collectors, whether they're librarians or private collectors. If I find something that I know that somebody would be interested in, I first go right to that person rather than think of putting it in a list or building a list around it. So I would say like 30% of my work goes towards that, direct quotes, and then, another 30% to lists, and then 40% to procrastination. And then, we have this virtual book fair universe that's developed in 2020. So that, again, adds a lot of structure to the calendar, because otherwise the days just seem to fly away. So there have been a few times where I've coincided lists with the virtual book fairs, but I think it's also developing into its own form. Most of them seem to have evolved around this showcase aesthetic, where there's just a grid of 3x3 or 3x4 items, and again, that tends to privilege more visual material, something that's compelling and can convince somebody to click on that icon. So that's becoming, I think that they'll outlast the pandemic, this sort of new form, and so that's just a different sort of venue to try to sell things through.
Yeah, and of course, speaking of shaking hands, you can't do that. But
New York. I was at the fair, which I guess was likely a seating event because it was in early March 2020. It was interesting how resistant, myself included, people were to not being able to shake hands. Like, it feels so much a part of that fair experience of walking into somebody's booth and shaking their hand. So people were trying that like really awkward elbow bump thing and whatnot, where I think I just took to bowing, but yeah.
Okay. Anything else about the new Antiquarianism?
I think it's important to not fetishize the newness of it. I mean, a lot of what's interesting in terms of reading, as you would know, like book trade histories, is that each generation kind of somehow had to figure out like the whole new paths in book collecting. I think it's important not to fetishize the fact that this new antiquarianism is new in of itself. Like, in a way, each generation of antiquarians is confronted with the question of how do you take, I mean, David Mason kind of famously put it in very simple terms that like antiquarians deal with books that are 100 years or items that are 100 years or older, and then everything else is just a secondhand book. But as time moves on, obviously those secondhand books become antiquarian. I think each wave of antiquarians need to confront the challenge of how do I make the past relevant to the present. We just happen to be doing that at a moment when print culture itself is being replaced by digital culture. And so I think it has an appearance that it's more new. It's more new than just new, that there's a newness to this kind of newness. But I think traditions in the book trade are an interesting and important resource for innovation and creativity. I think the other thing that we're also confronting is just, especially in cities like Toronto, is just the explosion of real estate markets, that's added another pressure altogether. One of the interesting commonalities from all those ABA interviews is you would often hear people when the interviewer would say, well, how did you get involved in the trade? They would suggest that they had been working at like a law firm or some other kind of office that had a building in downtown New York, and they would have a 1-hour lunch hour. And during that hour, they would wander out and there would be a bookshop that they would go into. And it was just like they could get lost in history there, and they developed a love for it. But there's sort of a double pincer movement where like it's very difficult for a bookshop to maintain a premises nearby where those office towers are. And then in addition, it's not that anybody has an hour-long lunch hour anymore. So I'd always visioned that model of a kind of way that the present pays a tax to the past, because you'd have all these lawyers and bankers and whatnot going in, spending money. But if they don't have a lunch hour and they don't have bookshops to go get lost in, there's no way for the past to actually get that tax back.
Other than them surfing the net and looking at your website.
So yeah, I think that the inbox now becomes some kind of analog to that experience. Yeah. And trying to give people opportunities in their day or in their week to spend time on their screens in a way that is maybe a bit different, is a bit more nourishing than if they're looking at a news website or whatnot. But obviously not if they're listening to a podcast.
They can go for a walk and listen to us talk.
There you go.
Well, it's interesting, your comment about the internet bringing prices down, sort of chasing them down, and innovative booksellers being driven to try and find new ways to make money. It speaks to the whole tradition of entrepreneurship in the book selling trade, which is and you've referenced this, which is inspiring. And I think what you're doing is inspiring. So thank you for taking the time to explain it to me and our listeners.
Cheers, I really appreciate it.
What's your website?
That is paperbooks.ca, which
paperbooks.ca.
Yeah, and you'll appreciate this. I tend to get like, oh, so you're from California. And then the other thing, I guess we could have talked about this too, is Instagram seems to be a space where a lot of this is happening as well. So on Instagram, I'm at Cloud Forgets.
Why not at Jason Rovito?
That's a good question. I like inconsistency.
Well, you're pretty consistent in putting out really interesting lists. So again, thanks for doing that and for doing what you do. It's appreciated.
Well, same here. I've been enjoying the recent interviews. It's been a nice way to get ready to cook dinner. That's for sure. Very
good. So Jason Rovito is the proprietor of Jason Rovito Bookseller, located not in California, in Toronto, Ontario. Thanks again.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. Bye.